So welcome to our new Fairbank Center for Chinese Studies series on books. We are delighted today to have a chance to talk with Ya-Wen Lei, who's professor of sociology, whose new book, Gilded Cage, Technology, Development, and State Capitalism in China, has just been published today. So firstly, congratulations.
Thank you so much, Dinda.
So wonderful to have you with us, Professor Lei. So let's just jump right in. Your previous book, The Contentious Public Sphere, focused on the public sphere and media in China. So what was it that made you, prompted your interest in researching China's new technology-oriented development?
So my first book was based on my dissertation, which I finished in 2013. And around that time, I was thinking about what kind of new project I would like to pursue. And I noticed a very rapid development in China's digital economy. And people were super excited about what they call China's 4 great new inventions, including online shopping, mobile payment, and share bikes, and the high-speed trains. And at the same time, I also noticed some changes in China's traditional manufacturing sectors. And I think at that time, some local governments in coastal provinces and some big companies were very eager to replace human workers with robots. And I was wondering what kind of economic transformation that would occur, and also the social consequences in this project. And also, one of the most important books I read about China's economic development was a book written by Professor Yashen Huang, Capitalism with Chinese Characteristic. But then the book was published in 2008. So I was wondering what kind of new development have unfolded since then.
A whole new era.
Yeah, a whole
absolutely.
new era. Yeah.
So what are some of, if you could briefly share with us, what are some of the key takeaways from your book?
So there are 3 major key takeaways. So the first is beyond China. So I argue that there are variations across countries, space, and time in terms of how nations, countries pursue techno development, and then how they distribute the benefits of this kind of development. And for example, in the US, techno development is accompanied with a higher level of inequality. And there are many factors that could influence this kind of process. For example, the political regime and the structure of the government and the strength of civil society and labor union. And also, importantly, ideologies believe about technology development and also ideology of meritocracy. And all of these factors could influence what kind of pathways a country would pursue. Yeah, wow. So that's the first takeaway.
Wow.
Only the first one.
That's a big one.
Right,
okay.
The comparison across countries. And then the second takeaway is about the specific features of China's techno-developmental model. So, so in China's model, there are 2 major power holders, so the government and also the big tech companies. So they both set the rules of the game through enacting a lot of technological, and legal instruments. So the government enacted a lot of these tools to steer or guide the transition. And tech companies have gained a lot of power, largely because of the Chinese government's previous, more lenient regulatory approach. And then, that's the 2 power holders. And then, another features of this regime is that this system is systematically, I think, biased against the people and also capital who were perceived as have less value to techno development. So the system tend to be tend to actually marginalize the working class. And the third characteristic is that this system actually creates a lot of legal unpredictability because of the increasing level of political, repressive political environment. And then the third takeaway is about the consequences, the effect of this kind of developmental model. So even though the government wanted to use this kind of instrument, technical and legal instrument to pursue efficiency. But at the same time, I think the governments and also a lot of officials, they have been actually caged by their own instruments, and this kind of process led to a lot of inefficiency. And this kind of model is not good for the government to get feedback and get inputs and about the disadvantage of the problem of the model. And then this kind of system is also led to the kind of undermine legal predictability and also the rights of citizens and workers, especially a disadvantaged social group. So that's the major takeaway.
Wow.
Yeah.
So you mentioned cage, and I'm curious about what you mean by the Gilded Cage. We know that Chen Yun, the sort of architect of modern China's economy in a sense, he talked about letting the market forces develop, but inside of a cage, with continuing strong controls by the state. So what about the Gilded Cage? What is that?
So the Gilded Cage has two components, right? One is like the gilded. I want to emphasize it's gilded because I really want to acknowledge and the really remarkable achievements of China in terms of developing economy. So within a very short period of time, China has developed the second largest digital economy and some of the largest internet companies in the world. And I think this kind of achievement is undeniable. So it has a very is a remarkable side. And on the other hand, I use the term cage, like the Gilded Cage, to refer to the kind of society that has been emerging in the process of techno development. As I mentioned, that both the Chinese government and also the tech companies have made a lot of technical and also legal instrument and to pursue techno development. And I think this kind of instrument forms some kind of cages, and everyone is controlled and has to actually live within this kind of cage. And when I say everyone, I mean I include even government officials. They are also restricted by this kind of cage, and also like ordinary citizens, business actors, workers, and everyone. So and I think this term, the Gilded Cage, is also related to a great sociologist, Max Weber's concept of iron cage. So he used the term to refer to the situation in which individuals are trapped into some kind of system in which people only consider efficiency, rational calculation, and control. And also, as you mentioned about Chen Yun's idea of bird cage, right? The cage kind of refer to the government's control of the economy. So that's why I decided to use the metaphor of the Gilded Cage.
So in your book, you don't put it in such kind of emotional terms, but to me, it sounds like a really cruel system. You argue that the state. You do argue that the state discriminates against certain types of capital and labor, right, because of their quote unquote inadequate contributions to technological development. Unquote. That sounds so cruel, kind of like dystopian in a way. So tell us what you mean by that.
Yeah. So in fact, one of the observation that motivated this project was a process called like some kind of government-initiated project called replacing humans with robots. So I think just around by the mid-2000s, so that's before the financial crisis, some local governments in coastal China began to face with the difficulty of lacking key resources in development, including electricity, water, and most importantly, land. And they also feel they have limited resources, physical resources in providing social, like public service to citizens, especially migrants, right? So the strategy they adopted is really to kind of allocate key resources to people or capital whom that they perceive really have made more contribution, and they think that's a more efficient way of allocating resources. But then the downside is that people who actually like a lot of the working class people, they need more resources, but they were discriminated by the system. So a sociological Eli Freeman, he wrote a great book on the education system in China. So he kind of emphasized that the Chinese government in coastal China created some kind of like inverted welfare state. So basically, usually like a welfare state kind of, they evaluate, I mean, they give more resources to people who need more help. But then in the Chinese situation, in coastal provinces, the local government did the opposite thing. They give more resources to people who already have the resources.
So did that result in a lot of the low-end workers basically going home, going back to their villages? Or did they just suffer in the kind of new economy?
I think it's a very complicated issue because in the process of techno development, a lot of factories move elsewhere. So some of the factories, because of the unfriendly regulatory environment and also the rising labor costs, so some factories actually move to inland China, and then some move to other parts of the world. And I actually interview a lot of, and also with the really unfolding of economic development, like younger generations of workers themselves don't want to work in factories. So it's a very complicated process, and I ask those factory workers whom I know in the fieldwork about how they think about this kind of strategy, the government's developmental policy, because that really discriminated this kind of the maybe low-end industry and workers there. And most of them, if they don't have children, then they think this process is inevitable. They also think they are not that deserving because they compare themselves with, for example, like engineers in Huawei or in Tencent. They thought those people are the future of China, and those companies, tech companies, are the future, but the futures are not them. But then when they have children, then they would complain about the situation because they know that in knowledge economy, education is the key, but compared with like Mao's era, they think now China has a high level of inequality, and they are okay with their own suffering. But I think Chinese people tend to be very tolerant and they understand the government. They try to do whatever they can do to make the country better. But for people with children, they just simply cannot really understand why their the children of workers, the children of peasants, don't have equal opportunities.
It seems, again, so tragic to me that they've sort of, what you're describing is they've kind of internalized the national propaganda, which is that you are not as valuable as other people, right? So tell us a little bit more about what the workers actually said to you. Like, what is their life like? And these, the couriers, for example, who zoom around on, motorbikes and deliver your coffee in 15 minutes, whatever. What do they tell you about their life and how they're
workers,
kind of controlled?
The delivery workers. So the reason I began to study food delivery workers was because when I was doing field work in the factories, I found some of my former interviewees quit their job. So for a younger generation of worker, they thought that it's really, working in factory deprived of their freedom. For example, in some factory, they were not allowed to use their mobile phone, and the discipline was very strict. And they think their life in the factory, they kind of live between like cafeteria and the workshop and the dorms. And they said it's like 3 points and a line, so very restricted. And but so many of them decided to leave the factory, so they moved to the food delivery or delivery, like the digital economy,
which seemed more free.
Right, more free because now they can use their phone all the time, and they could actually ride their scooter on the street. But quickly they found that the kind of discipline they have been receiving has actually been increasing because now they are controlled or managed by apps algorithm.
How does it work?
So, for example, if you work for a food delivery platform, then you have to use an app to take order, and then in this there are a lot of algorithm and also rules embedded in this kind of app. And for example, a food delivery company would require from the app, they will show you that show a worker that you have to finish your task within a time frame. If a worker fails to do so, they could be punished. So the app has some kind of point system, and they deduct points, and also they can deduct money from your accounts. And so that's the kind of punishment. And also the customer reviews would also reflect in those kind of systems. So there are a lot of different kind of punishments built in the app. And it's also, I think, something that surprised me the most is that, so usually we think, a lot of workers think when they see the peace rate is very low, then they would feel reluctant to accept those task assignments. But then the major platform company in China even punish worker for declining to accept those assignments. So the rate is very low, but if you don't accept the assignment, they will say, okay, now you cannot actually use my app to work for me anymore.
Wow.
So that kind of mechanism force workers to accept very task with very low payment. So in the end, many of my interviewees told me that, so in the past they work for the factory, they live in a cage. They use the word, actually the term cage with a fence. So they think because the factory there is kind of, it's bounded, right? There are boundaries. But then they told me they moved to a new cage with invisible fence.
Wow.
And they feel like in the past they worked like a robot, but now they exist like a driverless vehicle wandering on the street. That's the term they use to describe their life, like a driver. They see themselves as a driverless vehicle. Yeah.
So poetic. Oh
yeah,
my gosh.
yeah.
And
yeah.
they're competing with each other, right? But
Right.
do they sort of create
Right.
groups
Gaming.
of sort of alliance? Okay, so
Yeah, so gaming system. So you have to actually compete with each other. If you you finish more tasks, you get more points. They have some kind of ranking system. So these are the young generation. So they actually do the video games, online gaming, and they also their work environments also create some kind of games. So in their app, in their WeChat group, they share their gaming results in the regarding the video game. So that's the real video game they are playing. They share with each other. On the other hand, they also share the results of their gaming, their points in their work, delivery work. So,
but this is not a fun game.
This is basically
a ruthless.
Yeah, it's a
ruthless.
and also because I had a chance to do similar study in France for a year, so I also know a lot of delivery workers in France, and most of them are undocumented immigrants from Africa, and I compare the control system in France, in US, and also in China. And in China, I think the tech companies, the platform company, come up with the most extensive and intensive control mechanism. Yeah, right. And then when I share the results with my interviewees in France, the undocumented immigrants from Africa, they were super surprised.
Right,
yeah,
right. Oh,
yeah.
wow, that's amazing. So let's zoom out for a minute and talk about the big picture, which is the Chinese government's crackdown on the tech sector. So how do you view that? What is going on?
Yeah, so I think there are two major reasons. One is China's domestic factor. One is more kind of rising geopolitical tensions. So the Chinese government actually cares a lot about financial stability and systematic financial risk, especially since the late 2010. Because so in the past, the government really wants to have a big company like conglomerates, and that actually operate across different kind of sector, finance, like transportation, a lot of different kind of things like Hainan Hong Kong, right? And then after some of these companies went bankrupt, and the government they began to notice that the risk in one sector could actually spread to other sector, including financial sector. And at the same time, they also realized that a lot of China's internet company were so deeply involved in financial activity. So most of the big internet company provide lending service. So they provide microloans to individual user. And in 2020, N actually got more profits from online, this kind of microloan than online payment. But their main business is online payment, but they get more revenue from from loan, like micro loan.
Wow.
And the government thinks that this tech company actually bypassed. They found some kind of legal loophole to bypass the financial regulation. They saw the risk. And so that's one reason, like systematic financial risk, the risk could actually spread across sectors. And at the same time, like since 2018, the tension, the relation between China and the US became very bad. And so in the past, the government saw these big tech companies as China's national champion, even though they are private firms, but they kind of control a lot of very important digital infrastructure like online payment system and cloud. They have a lot of data. But then because of when the situation, the geopolitical tension rose, the government also realized that this company, when IPO in the US, they had to be subject to the regulation in the US. And how about the data, the
Sharing
national
data.
security
Yeah,
issue?
yeah.
So I think the domestic factor and also the geopolitical factor make them realize they have to do something to control this company that they once cultivated, but now they see that this company kind of went beyond their control. And look at what Jack Ma said to the financial regulators in China. So that really showed that Jack Ma, how he perceived his own power, right?
Had power.
Yeah.
Right. It always strikes me as so ironic, though, when you talk about the financial side of things, right?
Yeah.
That when this whole system began developing, of course, these companies were solving a problem that the government was facing, which was how do you get finances flowing to the system and provide finances to the entrepreneurial sector. And so the government was encouraging it.
Right.
But then it gets out of control.
Yeah, I think the problem in China is really when on the one hand, the government really want to cultivate things, but the kind of regulatory environment they have tend to accumulate risk because they don't want to, they see the tension between development and regulation. The government see the tension, so they don't want to regulate, but the problem is risk problem accumulate in the process that led to really large problem. And in the end, the government usually kind of take this kind of crackdown approach to tackle the problem.
Right.
Yeah.
And now, of course, you have a slowdown in the economy.
Yeah, economy. Right.
So you've talked about what seems to me a really unfair society, a deeply unfair society in which the government's exerting preference over high-tech, high-end tech workers, and in which there's, as you refer to as unchecked rule by instruments, right?
Yeah.
So we've seen a dramatic rise in technology in the West also, right? So
Absolutely.
and it's been driving the economy here and in more developed countries, the more developed countries as well. So what's the difference? Don't you see the same thing happening in the West, or is there a difference between what you see here and what you see in China?
Yeah, there are a lot of similarities and also some differences. So in the US, a lot of scholars also, one major scholar and a term called surveillance capitalism. So basically, the criticism is that tech companies in the US use data and technology like algorithm to manipulate individual behavior and collect data and profit from that. So I think that kind of stories and the government, and also they operate in a lax regulatory environment because of the lobby of these big tech firms. And I think similar situation happen in China, but I think from my own study, I found that tech companies in China, they even actually kind of have more power, instrumental power, than some tech companies in the largest. For example, they were able to operate in the finance sector, and also they actually, as I mentioned, they actually impose even more extensive and intensive control over workers. If you compare the U.S. case and the Chinese case, so similar. The companies they have like across country they have extraordinary powers. Yeah, that's quite similar, and but I think there are also differences in China because I mentioned that there are two major power holders. We cannot really neglect the power of the Chinese government in terms of enacting all kinds of regulations and also when the Chinese government, so they can regulate everyone, right? They decide the distribution of resources like a citizenship. And in the US, for example, the governments wouldn't really make that kind of like allocate like who can get what kind of. I mean, they do that for international, like people who don't have American citizens, but they don't really do that to domestic American citizens. But in China, the government, the scope of government intervention is really large. And also, I think the regulatory system is very different. And so in the Chinese case, when the government want to regulate anyone, then the business and also people who are regulated have very limited legal channels to actually solve their problem if they don't if they are not happy with the government's administrative decision. And in the U.S., you can see like the courts play a major role in the process, and the executive branch has limited power, right? So the power is kind of shared, and the executive branch is overseen by the courts, right? But in China, the government, the difference is the government really has a lot of powers over everyone, and they can distribute so many kinds of resources, including like citizenship and a lot of things. Yeah.
Right, and this is what you're talking about is really sort of the pros and cons of the Chinese system. Because on the positive side, as you said at the beginning, what they've achieved is remarkable.
Right, really remarkable.
They know how to plan, and they know how to. They say we're going to go into technology, and then they have a plan and they move ahead. But on the other side, you know, what are the consequences? And one of the things I love about your work so much is, you know, you look at what we all kind of say, marvel at, oh my God, 40 years of incredible development, and it is incredible. Yeah. But then you say, well, wait a minute, let's look under the hood and sort of see what's really happening, what's happening to people. And it's just, you know, utterly fascinating to see you know, how complicated and how in many ways, you know, unequal and to my mind, cruel the system can be. So my last question for you, I think I really have to ask you a little bit about the future. Like it seems like an untenable situation, like a situation that can't, I guess my question is, what does it all add up to? You know, are these inequities that you talk about and that you see, that you've really documented, is this sustainable? What do you think will happen? It's a big tough question.
I mean, talking about future is always a very tough questions. So I think the government has realized the problem. So they have been dealing with the problem. So they try to crack down the big techs and enact more regulations, and including some regulation that could protect workers. But the problem is that I think they don't really kind of improve the rule of law. So they use these kind of ad hoc ways to solve the problem, and they still don't, for example, in terms of the labor issue, they still don't allow laborers to have their unions and they crack down on the collective actions organized by workers. So I would think that what they can achieve could be very limited. What the government could achieve could remain very limited. And also in terms of like people, right? How would they respond to this kind of situation? So I think in the past, people see really the facade of this really the gilded cage, right? People are so proud of China's remarkable development within a very short period of time. And in my interview, many people told me that China can achieve such things within, it only took China decades, but it took other countries like hundreds of years. But I think in the future, it will become more difficult for the Chinese government to mobilize this kind of discourse because when people begin to see the limits of this kind of development model. And now the younger generation, I think this is the first generation in which they began to experience downward mobility in their life, and right? Because in the past, after the economic reform, everyone China only rise, right?
Better,
Right, so I think it will be, so that's why now there are more and more young people, they don't want to play the game anymore, right? They don't want to have children. they don't want to get married, they don't want to work so hard, and
Right.
so.
And so you see this whole Tamping, the
Yeah,
whole lying
yeah.
flat
I
phenomenon,
think
right?
there are, I mean, people don't see meaning because what's the meaning of playing this game? In the end, you are trapped in that kind of system. So I think people kind of, they take individual action and trying to kind of avoiding being trapped in that kind of system. And also we see a lot of, I think the immigration, there could be more and more immigration. And I mean, when I was interviewed, like upper middle class, especially professional class engineers, and many of them asked me questions about immigration, like Canada, not the US, Canada is one of the top choices. Yeah. So
Wow.
yeah.
Well, thank you so much
No
for
problem.
your insights. I mean, I have learned so much by talking
you,
to you,
Dinda.
and we can't wait for your next project. So everybody should go out and read The Gilded Cage. It's
Thank
a
you so
fabulous
much.
book,
Thank
and
you,
we look forward
Dinda.
to following your next project.
Thank you, Dinda.
Thank you, Professor Lei.